does Ghost summon up the powers of the Dark Lord using only the riffs? Let's find out. Well, hey there guys and ghouls, it's your good buddy, Uncle Ben. Ghost is one of my favorite hard rock bands to come out over the past 10 or 20 years. And I find myself listening to them a lot, especially this time of year, because they have a knack for writing simple riffs that just sound so dang evil.
But Uncle Ben, how do they make devil sound? Por qué?
Well, Junior, as I've transcribed a bunch of their songs, I've noticed that they have a knack for a handful of particular intervallic combinations that tend to yield up the sounds that please the Dark Lord. And in today's video, we're going to break down 5 of their most iconically evil riffs. That way you guys can learn these tricks and start using them in your own riffage too. As always, you guys can find full tabs and charts for this lesson over on my Instagram page at Ben Eller Guitars. Just search for hashtag WeekendWankShop253. Learn these riffs, follow along. Downloadable tabs, backing tracks, bonus lessons, and more are available to everybody who supports my channel over on my Patreon page. Be sure to head on over to patreon.com/Ben Eller Guitars. Find the tier that suits you the best and start reaping the benefits today. Thanks. Everything guitar and bass wise is tuned down one whole step. D, G, C, F, A, D. Let's start off here by taking a look at the most simple riff on this list. It's on their first album and uses those evil intervals very explicitly. I remember reading in an interview a long time ago with Tobias where he said that that was actually the very first riff that was ever written for Ghost. So you can kind of see this as being sort of the primordial satanic sludge that everything else in the band's career emerged out of. So the first thing that we hear in this after the very ominous drum intro that just seems to kind of like spell out exactly how the riff is going to go is that big bass riff, which is definitely played on a P-type bass. So I'm using my LSL Balboa to fulfill the bass duties today. This riff only contains 2 different intervals, and they are key to understanding the aggressive and dark sound of so many metal riffs. It's the flat second and the flat fifth. Now the root of this riff is based around that low D that we have in this tuning. And that flat second interval is the first thing that we hear. Sometimes people call this a minor second. Tomato, tomato. And basically what that means is it's a half step away from the root. Okay, so if this is the root, minor second or flat second is right here on the first fret. You know, it goes all the way back to like Jaws, right? That minor second interval just has evil inside of it, and 80 billion metal riffs have been based around that interval right there. So after they go through that a few times, they come up here and hit the octave of the root. Okay, so this isn't like a new interval, it's just an octave. But that is followed by the granddaddy of all evil intervals, the flat fifth, sometimes called the tritone or the devil's interval. You can really easily spell out what a flat fifth is 2 different ways. You could say it is the note 3 whole steps above the root. So if our root is here at D, and we go up a step, and another step, that leads us up here to fret 6. Again, name your favorite Marilyn Manson song, it's right there. Another really great way to visualize a flat fifth is just to make a power chord and make the high note a half step lower. Spoopy. So yeah, that's all there is to it. The flat second and the flat fifth intervals produce some really evil, aggressive tones right out of the gate. One of the guitars is essentially just playing the bass riff with some power chords. The way the second guitar plays along with the riff is actually quite a lot different and features this sneaky little harmonic in place of the octave.
For extra evil.
Up next, let's break down another really menacing riff from the band's second album. the gate, they hit us with the tritone. Once again, the devil's interval right out of the gate right there. And again, that is the note 3 whole steps above the root. But after this is where the riff gets a little bit more interesting to me. Now, in reference to the root note, those 2 power chords and represent a minor 6 or flat 6 interval, as in the distance from the root to 6th note of a minor scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then the next one is a major 6 interval. Now that's the 1st to 6th note in a major scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's giving us a minor 6 and a major 6. Which is a really confusing sound that not really a lot of scales have. It's like our ears don't really know how to compute that when they hear those 2 intervals against each other. It's like, does it sound minor and sad, or does it sound major and kind of happy? It's kind of hard to say when they're both being used right next to each other like that. That right there is one of the only scales that I can think of off the top of my head that contains the flat 5th, that tritone, as well as a minor 6 and a major 6. And that scale is the whole half diminished scale, which is just a series of whole steps and half steps. So start from the root, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, there's that tritone. Whole step, there's our minor 6. Half step, there's our major 6. So far you have then a whole step and a half again. You're back at root. These symmetrical scales that are just a series of whole and half steps, or half and whole steps in the case of the half whole diminished scale, are really confusing to our ears because it never really sounds like it hits home base. You know, like whenever you play like a major scale, there's a definite start and end to that. But with these symmetrical scales, every note sounds just as important as the other, and it never really seems to end. So I think that kind of whole half diminished sound contributes to the ultimate evil in this riff. I want to point out something cool and interesting that the bass is doing in this riff too that I think makes it sound a little bit more haunting. Now it starts off just basically aping what the guitar is doing, getting your root and tritone right out of the gate. But then instead of doing what the guitar does, which is climb higher and higher to grab that flat 6 and major 6 sound, instead the bass decides to play those lower. So the bass starts off by going, but then instead of going for the higher 6s like that, he decides to put those notes an octave lower. So you get this cool contrast where you got the guitars that are going up in pitch and the bass which is actually going lower in pitch and meeting those creepy 6s an octave lower. Next, let's talk about a cut off of their 3rd album that opens up with what I consider to be one of the best heavy metal bass riffs ever. Now, this riff is centered around a principle that I think most metal bands underutilize, which is not basing a riff off of the lowest note on your instrument, but rather one a little bit higher. That way you've always got room to go lower later in the riff or later in the song. A lot of times heavy metal bands and stuff, they just start off flobbing on whatever their lowest note is. By the time you get to, the breakdown or whatever, you've heard it so much that it's like not really that heavy anymore. But whenever you have riffs that take advantage of some of the higher range of your instrument and you leave room to go lower later, stuff can get shockingly heavy out of nowhere. Okay, really sick riff. Again, definitely a P bass. Definitely using some dark glass gear to get that dirt and grit on the bass tone. What I'm doing is I've got the Fractal running a model that's kind of like an Ampeg SVT, and I'm running that through the Neural DSP B7K bass plugin that Dark Glass makes, which is just freaking awesome. I'm using the vintage setting on there. Okay, so for this riff, I'm thinking of the E, the 2nd fret on that low string, as being the root note. And if you take a look at the sum total of intervals that are being played against that root, you start coming across some really interesting things, because right out of the gate here, the first thing that we hear is a minor third, or flat third interval. Again, that's a note 1.5 steps above the root. So if your root's here, minor third is like this, just like throwing the horns. Now that minor third interval is used in about 80 billion different blues and rock riffs. But the thing that makes it interesting is that it's right next to the major third interval. Again, major third being the distance between the first and third notes in a major scale. Do, re, mi, right? Again, there's that duality that we're going to see in a lot of these riffs where you have a minor interval, like this minor third, right next to a major interval, the major third, which makes things very disorienting to our ears. It's like you can't really tell heads from tails or major from minor when you're using those two contrasting intervals against each other all the time. And again, you'll notice right there, again, by leaving room to go lower, that gives us access to that low D note, which against that major third, there's that tritone again. Again, that devil's interval creeps up in all of these riffs. So all kinds of cool stuff in that riff. Minor third, minor 7, major 7. Again, two major and minor intervals right next to each other. Leads to a really odd sound. Now, if you're looking at an answer of what scale kind of yields those particular intervals, the only one that I could think of that really has that kind of major third and minor third thing, as well as some of the notes that the guitar melody picks up on, which we'll talk about next, would be the half-whole diminished scale. And what that is starting off on a root note, like our E note right here, and just descending in a series of half steps and whole steps. Half-whole, like this. You see right away that yields the minor second, the jaws interval, as well as the minor third and major third interval. So it's just a series of half and whole steps all the way through the octave. And like what I was saying about the whole half diminished scale, it yields a very unstable sound where your ears can't really tell where the root is. So the whole thing just sounds strange and unpredictable. So you'll remember me saying a second ago about how that half-whole diminished scale generates all those signature evil intervals. You got the minor second, the combination of minor and major third, as well as that tritone, the flat 5 interval. That high lead melody that comes in here takes advantage of all those intervals and kind of creates this strange, like, major, minor, tritone smear that just sounds so wicked. Okay, so look at it this way. The riff is based around a root note of E, so it makes sense that the first thing that the lead does here is outline an E minor arpeggio like this. You can see as I play through that there, I've got the root note, the minor third, the fifth, the root note again, an octave higher, and then back to the 5. Again, that's just a standard E minor arpeggio. But what he does is to immediately go back to that 5th, and then drop it down to the flat 5. So again, in your ears, you're having this E note kind of ringing against all that stuff through the bass guitar and rhythm guitars, and you get this sound of regular 5th, just kidding, spooky flat 5. Which are two of the intervals that, again, that half-whole diminished scale yields. It gives you major and minor third, as well as 5th and flat 5th intervals. So after he introduces you to that flat 5 sound, kind of again flirting with flat 5 and regular 5 right there, there's the minor third, there's the major third. So again, you're kind of getting these mixed signals of like, does this have a 5 or a flat 5 in it? Does this have a third or a minor third in it? It's just kind of giving you all this conflicting information throughout the entire melody. I love the groove and tones being used at the first of this song, but I think it's that combination of 5th and flat 5th being used right against the major third and minor third that really pushed this riff over into the lake of fire. Up next, we're going to take a look at one of the band's newer riffs that demonstrates their unusual approach to writing harmony for guitars. Check it out. and all of its harmonies are based around the harmonic minor scale, which is just like a minor scale, only the 7th note is a half step higher, so it's a major 7 instead of a minor 7 like a minor scale usually has. That yields all kinds of awesome results. For more information about the harmonic minor scale, be sure to check out last week's video where I show you guys some of my favorite tricks for conjuring up some spooky sounds out of that scale. So the first set of melodies that you hear are played in octaves, where one track is doing the low octave, another track is doing the high octave. I think part of the reason that melody is so effectively spooky is because it ends on that major 7 interval, a half step away from the root. So when you hear that melody go down, when the next power chord hits, it kind of seems to complete that melody. So you have a little bit of tension because that melody ends on that major 7 interval. And then you have a little bit longer fill that takes place after that. So again, by finally resolving and ending on the root right here, that lick gains a little bit of resolution, whereas the first ones have kind of left you hanging. But then the later part of the riff, the harmony starts to spice up a little bit, and we get to this section. It's got a really cool kind of neoclassical, roughly shirt kind of sound to it. And at first, if you were to play the melodies that the low guitar is doing, in combination with this line that the high guitar is doing, you'd notice it's basically just high diatonic thirds. In other words, for whatever note guitar 1 is on, guitar 2 is 3 notes ahead of it in the scale. This is a typical kind of harmony that you hear in like Iron Maiden and classic Metallica and stuff like that. Diatonic thirds harmony. So the 2 lines together would sound like this. But when it goes to the 3rd section here, the 5/8 section, the guitar harmony part changes quite a lot. It sounds like this. Now to this point that it breaks away from being diatonic thirds. And again, if I was to play that along with the low melody, it sounds something like this. So what you get right there is the first part of the harmony are 6s but up an octave. Now like I said a second ago, if a 3rd harmony is where you take 1 note in the scale and then you play the note 3 ahead of it, a 6th harmony is kind of like you play the note 6 notes ahead of whatever note guitar 1 is on. So they move up a 6 and up 1 octave to achieve that first set of sounds that we hear. After this is where things get a little bit more interesting. Again, guitar 1's line is, guitar 2's line is. So whereas guitar number 1's line is exclusively ascending towards the root, you'll notice that guitar 2's part ascends, goes up way higher in the scale, and then descends down onto the minor 3rd of the chord. So again, you do end with resolution right there. You end with that good strong minor harmony because guitar 1 ends on the root, guitar 2 ends on the minor 3rd. But the process of getting there is really interesting because they're playing in the same scale together, but they're not headed in the same direction. It's kind of like they're going together, kind of branch off, and then end up back at a spot again that makes sense harmonically. You'll notice a little bit of what we call contrapuntal movement. Forgive my backwoods Tennessee pronunciation of that. What that means is that things are going in opposite directions before they meet up again. This is a technique used all over classical music. Check out like Bourrée in E minor by Bach. It's full of that contrapuntal movement that I'm talking about. It creates a really cool sound to our ears because you think you know where it's going, and then, like I said before, it branches off in its own direction before getting all 4 wheels back on the road again and meeting up at that ending harmony. Really cool stuff. And the second section of the intro is that big dirty riff that uses kind of a combination of all of our favorite, metal intervals, like that flat 5th, the flat 2nd. That is then immediately countered with a regular 2nd, sliding into that minor 3rd. Again, that makes things kind of harmonically unstable to have that amount of chromaticism all happening right there, that close to the root. And the last riff that we're going to talk about today uses about every harmonic trick in Satan's little playbook to conjure up some really dark and ominous sounds. Scope it out. Okay, this riff has got literally everything that we've talked about in it so far. It's got the flat second, it's got the flat fifth, it's got the weird harmonies that aren't really diatonic and don't really go in the same direction and stuff later on in the riff. It's so cool. First thing that I want to talk about here is the fact that there are two different ways to play this riff that the band utilizes. So the song starts off with that nice acoustic guitar intro, and the guitars are playing the riff more here in the open position whenever they play this part. That's because there's so many of these little half step away from each other dissonant sounding intervals, like the 5 and the flat 5 that we hear right away in the first of the riff, that sound even more dissonant if you're letting them ring out as open strings. Now you'll notice whenever you play the riffs up here in this position with the distortion on, those notes aren't ringing together, because whenever you have those open strings ringing out with a bunch of distortion on your tone, it just kind of starts to become extremely messy really fast. But on an acoustic guitar or a clean tone, you can get away with that kind of thing much easier. So yeah, I love the fact that the band had the forethought to play this riff two different ways. One that suited the ringing open string sound of the acoustic guitar, and another way that was better suited to play with high gain distorted guitars and single notes. Again, that is just metal in a nutshell. It's got a very like Slayer, like South of Heaven sound. And again, these are a lot of the same intervals that you've heard in those riffs. Establishing with a fifth right there. You remember earlier I talked about how you can take a power chord and smush that high note down to get your flat 5. It's exactly what they do. Here's a confusing move. Again, a little chromaticism right there, using the second, minor third, second, and flat second intervals. Again, this guy is your root right here, so to have all this chaos in front of it makes it a really unstable sound, which is cool. A little more chromaticism right here, walking down to, guess what, that tritone again. And then lastly, a little more chromaticism from second and flat second down to root to get you back to tonal home bass. The harmony of the riff changes a little bit, and the way that guitar 1 and 2 work together, or work against each other in some ways, is really fascinating and makes some very dark tones. Here's guitar 1. Whereas guitar 2 sounds like this. If you play those two together on one guitar, you'd see and hear just how strange and counterintuitive they are. Again, it's really all over the place harmony-wise. You start off with some fifths, like Slayer, then these are sixes, kind of weird. And then this mess, which starts off with some of that contrapuntal up and down crisscross action before descending down chromatically in major thirds. That's like a Dave Mustaine Megadeth favorite. He uses major thirds all over the place. Listen to like, Holy Wars. You'll hear tons of that stuff all over that. And then when you get to this section, you can again see some minor third action, fourths stacked on top of each other, more fourths, that result in this major third sound. Now this sound that they end on is actually pretty logical to me. This kind of sounds like, again, if our root note is D, that means our 5 chord would be right here. Kind of sounds like a suspension, letting down, being like a major chord, which makes that resolution to your 1 minor really strong. That right there was both guitar parts arranged for one guitar, so you can specifically see, again, some of that weird harmonic movement going on there. So whenever I was first figuring this riff out and I could hear one guitar and the bass were making that move down to the flat 5, I just kind of figured in typical, heavy metal fashion that if one guitar is doing this 3-note chromatic move, the other guitar would be doing the same move, maybe move down like, a minor third in the scale, which would give you this sound. really dark, kind of death metal-y sort of sound. Or maybe even, you know, it's playing that same chromatic move, but a major third down, so it's like this. More typical of what you'd see in like a Megadeth or Gojira song. So I was pretty surprised to find out that while one of them is doing a chromatic move down to the flat 5, the other guitar is doing a move that is more like something you'd see in just a straight up minor scale. He's playing this. So those two things in conjunction with each other yield this interesting sound where you've got these minor thirds and these chromatic major thirds right next to each other. Before again hitting that flat 2 and starting the riff over. Unusual choices, but I love how eerie those things sound. It's like you got one thing that makes sense and another thing that doesn't make sense. Two great tastes combined as one. But I think one of the real secret weapons of what makes this riff sound so evil and heavy is that big guitar laying down the big old daddy notes down low on the fat strings. So you'll notice during the first part of the riff, the really ominous Slayer sounding part, the bass is just hitting the root and octaves pairing up with the drums, right? By having the bass play nothing but that big ass low D root note against everything, while the guitars are doing their spooky stuff up high, it really lets you hear and appreciate how ominous all of those intervals, again, that 5 and flat 5, 2 and flat 2 being mixed together, how ominous they sound in contrast to the root note. It's like the bass, just keeping it really simple there, lets you hear how spooky all those notes sound when they're compared against home bass. Also, I really love how the bass plays against the heavy verse riff that follows that spooky intro. Just kind of reminds you of like Michael Anthony back in the early Van Halen days, you know? Just stay on the root, let the guitars do all the fancy stuff up top, create a big heavy framework for those riffs to sit on. It's all those simple little things that the bass guitar is doing throughout this that really help propel this riff down into the fiery depths of Beelzebub's Inferno. Well guys, I hope that gives you all some ideas about some of the harmonic and intervallic tricks that Ghost and other heavy metal bands use to conjure up some real evil sounds. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for new content coming at you every single week. And if you like what you see and want to say thanks, be sure to support my channel over on my Patreon page, patreon.com/Ben Eller Guitars. Well guys, I hope you all are having a very happy Halloween season, but it's time to get away from the computer, pick up your guitar, and start conjuring up some dark and ominous sounds. Less clicking, more picking.